The deafening crack of a Winchester rifle shattered the dawn silence as Deacon Kincaid fired a warning shot into the air, scattering the vultures that had begun to circle the fresh graves on the outskirts of Redemption Springs. The year was 1876, and death had become as common as dust in this unforgiving corner of the Arizona Territory. Sweat trickled down Deacon's sun-weathered face as he returned the rifle to its leather scabbard on his horse. At 32, he'd seen more death than most men twice his age. The war between the states had claimed his youth, and the lawless frontier seemed determined to claim what remained of his soul. Yet here he stood, among the graves of strangers, driving away scavengers and offering what little dignity he could to those who had fallen. With practiced hands, he pulled lumber from his packhorse and began his solemn work. The crosses were simple 2 pieces of wood joined together with careful precision. He'd made dozens since arriving in Redemption Springs 6 months ago, each one marking another life cut short by disease, violence, or the harsh realities of frontier life. "I don't understand why you bother," a voice called out, pulling Deacon from his thoughts. Sheriff Miller approached on horseback, the morning sun glinting off his tarnished badge. "These were just a bunch of drifters. Nobody's coming to mourn them." Deacon continued his work, hammering with steady, deliberate strokes. "Doesn't matter who they were, everyone deserves to be remembered." The sheriff shook his head. "You're a strange one, Kincaid. Fought for the South. Now you're out here building memorials for every poor soul who drops dead in my jurisdiction." He spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Town's starting to talk. Some say you're doing penance. Others say you're just plain touched in the head." "Let them talk," Deacon replied, not looking up from his work. "I've got crosses to build." The sheriff shrugged and turned his horse back toward town. "Suit yourself, but there's a stage coming in this afternoon. Might be bringing supplies we actually need, like a schoolteacher. Townspeople are gathering to meet it. You might consider joining the living for a change." Deacon didn't respond. He'd heard about the teacher. Redemption Springs was growing, and the town council had finally scraped together enough money to hire someone to educate the children. It didn't concern him. His world had narrowed to this grim task, marking the resting places of the dead, and keeping the memory of his own losses buried deep inside. By midday, he'd finished 3 crosses, each bearing the name of its occupant carefully burned into the wood. With the last one planted firmly in the dry earth, he stepped back, removed his hat, and offered a silent prayer. Not that he believed anyone was listening anymore. As he gathered his tools, the distant sound of the stagecoach horn echoed across the valley. Right on time. He considered the sheriff's words for a moment, then decided against heading into town. The living made him uneasy these days. The dead asked nothing of him but remembrance. Yet as he mounted his horse, something made him pause. Perhaps it was the unsettling stillness in the air or some half-forgotten sense developed during the war, but Deacon felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Scanning the horizon, he spotted dust rising from the direction of the stage road, but it wasn't the orderly cloud of a coach in transit. This was scattered, erratic. Trouble, without hesitation, he spurred his horse toward the disturbance, rifle in hand. As he crested the ridge overlooking the road, the scene below confirmed his worst suspicions. The stagecoach lay on its side, one wheel spinning uselessly in the air. Bodies were scattered on the ground, the driver slumped over a rock, a guard face down in the dirt. 3 riders circled the wreckage, their faces covered with bandanas as they fired into the overturned coach. Deacon assessed the situation in seconds, an old habit that had kept him alive through 4 years of war and 8 years of wandering. The outlaws hadn't spotted him yet. He had the high ground and the element of surprise. Taking careful aim, he squeezed the trigger. The first outlaw tumbled from his saddle before the sound of the shot reached him. The second managed to wheel around before Deacon's next bullet caught him in the shoulder, sending him sprawling. The third returned fire, bullets kicking up dust near Deacon's position, but the distance and elevation made accuracy impossible. After emptying his revolver uselessly, the final bandit spurred his horse and fled, leaving his wounded companion screaming curses. Deacon approached cautiously, keeping his rifle trained on the injured outlaw. "Don't move," he commanded, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Go to hell," the wounded man spat, clutching his bloody shoulder. "You first," Deacon replied evenly, dismounting and binding the man's hands with a length of rope from his saddle. Once secure, he approached the overturned coach, unsure of what or who he might find inside. "Hello," he called out, peering through the shattered window. "Anyone alive in there?" A muffled sound came from within, followed by a woman's voice, shaky but determined. "Yes, please help us." Deacon pulled the door open, now facing skyward due to the coach's position. Inside, a young woman cradled an older man's head in her lap. Blood seeped from a wound in the man's chest, and his breathing came in ragged gasps. "My father," the woman explained, her voice tight with fear. "He's been shot." Deacon reached down to help her. "Let me get you out first, then we'll tend to him." "No," she insisted. "Him first, please." There was something in her voice, a quiet dignity amidst the chaos that reminded Deacon of his mother in those terrible days after Shiloh, when the wounded filled every available building in their small Tennessee town. He nodded once and carefully maneuvered himself into the coach to assess the injured man. "What's your name?" he asked the woman as he examined the wound. "Josephine Gray," she replied, brushing a strand of copper-colored hair from her face. "This is my father, William. We were coming to Redemption Springs. I'm to be the new schoolteacher." Deacon met her eyes. They were green, he noticed, like summer grass back home, and saw both fear and resolve there. "I'm Deacon Kincaid. This wound is serious but not necessarily fatal. We need to get him to town to the doctor." Together, they managed to extract William from the coach. Deacon fashioned a travois from the coach door and some harness leather, creating a makeshift stretcher that could be pulled behind his horse. After securing the wounded outlaw to his own mount, Deacon helped Josephine onto the horse, then led them toward town, the dying man stretched out behind them. "The driver and guard?" Josephine asked quietly. "Dead," Deacon replied, not sugarcoating the truth. "I'll come back for them after we get your father to the doctor." She nodded, her shoulders straight despite the ordeal. "And you'll mark their graves?" Deacon glanced back at her, surprised. "How did you know the crosses?" she said. "I saw them as we passed the cemetery." "They're new, freshly carved, and you have woodworking tools in your saddlebag." A faint, sad smile crossed her lips. "I notice things. My mother said it would make me a good teacher." "It will," he agreed, though he found himself uncomfortable under her perceptive gaze. As they approached town, Sheriff Miller and several townspeople hurried to meet them, drawn by the gunshots and the sight of the wounded. Dr. Patterson immediately took charge of William Gray, directing men to carry him to the clinic, while the sheriff took custody of the injured outlaw. "You've had a busy day, Kincaid," Miller remarked with newfound respect. "Seems you can do more than hammer crosses together after all." Josephine stepped forward. "This man saved our lives, Sheriff. Those outlaws would have killed us all." The sheriff nodded. "Then we owe him our thanks." "Miss Gray, I presume, we've been expecting you, though not quite like this." "I should get back to the stage," Deacon interrupted, uncomfortable with the attention. "The bodies." "I'll send men," Miller assured him. "You've done enough today." But Deacon was already turning his horse around. "I'll do it. It's what I do." Before he could leave, he felt a hand on his arm. Josephine stood beside him, her green eyes meeting his. "Thank you, Mr. Kincaid, for everything." He nodded awkwardly, unaccustomed to gratitude, and rode away back to the familiar comfort of his grim duty. By sunset, Deacon had recovered the bodies of the driver and guard, bringing them back to town for proper burial. As he worked on new crosses in the fading light, footsteps approached from behind. "I thought I might find you here," Josephine said, her voice soft in the gathering darkness. Deacon didn't look up from his carving. "Your father, resting." "Dr. Patterson removed the bullet and says he has a good chance if infection doesn't set in." She paused, watching his hands work the wood. "You're very skilled at that." "Had practice," he replied tersely. "Too much, I imagine." She settled on a nearby rock, apparently in no hurry to leave. "The sheriff told me you do this for everyone who dies here, whether you knew them or not." Deacon continued working, uncomfortable with her presence yet finding himself unwilling to send her away. "Someone should. Why you?" She asked, her question direct but gentle, his hands stilled for a moment. No one had asked him that before, not directly. People speculated, but no one had simply asked. Because I survived when better men didn't, he finally said. Seems like the least I can do. Josephine was quiet for a long moment. My brother died at Cold Harbor, she finally said. He was 19, we never found his grave. Deacon looked up then, seeing the old pain reflected in her eyes. I was there, he said quietly. Different side, but I was there. She nodded, no judgment in her expression. That's what I thought when I heard your accent, Southern but trying to hide it. A small smile touched her lips. I noticed things, remember? Too many things, he muttered, returning to his work. Perhaps, she agreed. But I notice you haven't asked me to leave. The observation caught him off guard, and for the first time in years, Deacon found himself almost smiling. Seems you've got me there, Miss Gray. Josephine, she corrected. Or Josie to my friends, and I hope we might be friends, Mr. Kincaid. I'll be staying in Redemption Springs after all, and I have precious few friends here so far. Deacon, he offered in return, surprising himself. She smiled then, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, and Deacon felt something stir within him, something he had thought long dead, buried in the blood-soaked fields of Tennessee and Virginia. Well, Deacon, she said, rising from her seat, I should return to my father. But I wanted to thank you properly and to see the man who builds crosses for the fallen. As she turned to leave, Deacon found his voice again. I'll check on him tomorrow, he called after her. Your father. Josephine paused, looking back over her shoulder. I'd like that, she said simply, and then she was gone, walking back toward town, leaving Deacon alone with his crosses and his thoughts, which for the first time in years were not solely focused on the dead. The next few weeks brought changes to Redemption Springs. William Gray recovered slowly but steadily. Moving from the doctor's clinic to a small house the town council had secured for the new schoolteacher and her father. Josephine began organizing the schoolhouse, preparing for classes to begin, and Deacon found himself drawn into her orbit, initially under the pretext of checking on her father's recovery. William Gray proved to be a retired professor from Boston with a sharp mind and dry wit, despite his weakened condition. He welcomed Deacon's visits, eager for conversation that extended beyond his health and the local gossip provided by well-meaning neighbors. Your woodworking skills are impressive, William remarked one afternoon as he examined a small carved horse Deacon had brought for the schoolhouse. Self-taught, Deacon shook his head. My father was a furniture maker before the war. He taught me when I was young. And after the war. He didn't come home, Deacon replied, the familiar ache dulled by time but never absent. Died at Antietam. William nodded thoughtfully. So many good men lost on both sides. He studied Deacon with keen eyes. My son would have been about your age now. The conversation shifted then to the school, and Deacon found himself offering to build desks for the students. They're sitting on crates now, he explained. Proper desks would make learning easier. That's very kind, Josephine said, entering the room with tea. Her hair was pinned up with tendrils escaping around her face from a day spent cleaning the schoolhouse. But I couldn't ask you to donate so much time. You didn't ask, Deacon pointed out. I offered. William chuckled. He's got you there, Josie, and so a pattern emerged. Deacon would spend his mornings tending to the cemetery and building his crosses when needed, then afternoons at the schoolhouse constructing desks, bookshelves, and a sturdy teacher's desk for Josephine. They worked in comfortable companionship, occasionally sharing stories from their past's carefully edited versions that avoided the deepest wounds. Deacon learned that Josephine had been teaching in Boston before deciding to come west after her mother's death the previous winter. William, retired and widowed, had chosen to accompany his daughter rather than remain alone in the family home filled with memories. It was an adventure, William explained one evening as they sat on the small porch of the Gray home. Though I must say, getting shot was not part of the plan. Father, Josephine admonished, though her lips twitched with amusement. What, can't an old man make light of his brush with mortality? He winked at Deacon. Besides, it's brought some unexpected blessings. We might never have made your acquaintance otherwise, Deacon. The comment hung in the air, weighted with meaning that Deacon wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. He mumbled something about needing to check on his horse and excused himself, feeling Josephine's eyes following him as he walked away. The school opened in early October with 12 students ranging from 6 to 16. Deacon watched from a distance as the children filed into the building, Josephine standing at the door greeting each one by name. She'd visited every family in the area, introducing herself and explaining her vision for the school. Her dedication impressed the townspeople, many of whom had initially been skeptical of the refined Eastern woman. That evening, Deacon found her at the schoolhouse, organizing papers by lamplight. "You should be celebrating," he said from the doorway. "First day complete." Josephine looked up, her face brightening at the sight of him. "Deacon, I didn't hear you come in." She gestured to the papers. "Just preparing for tomorrow, so much to do." It went well. "Better than I expected," she admitted. "The children are eager to learn, even Tom Jenkins, though he pretends otherwise." Deacon nodded, knowing the sullen 14-year-old whose father ran the livery stable. He's had to be the man of the house since his pa hurt his back last year. "Doesn't leave much time for being a boy." Josephine studied him thoughtfully. "You notice more than people realize, don't you?" He shrugged, uncomfortable with her insight. "Town this size, everyone knows everyone's business. And yet you remain a mystery." She set down her papers and approached him. "You know so much about everyone here, but few know anything about you beyond your skill with wood and your dedication to the cemetery." "Not much else to know," he replied, though they both recognized the evasion. Josephine stood before him now, close enough that he could smell the faint lavender scent she wore. "I think there's a great deal more, Deacon Kincaid. I think you're a good man who carries too much alone." Her words struck too close to truths he'd buried deep, and Deacon took a step back. "It's getting late. I should let you finish your work." Disappointment flickered across her face, quickly masked. "Of course. Thank you for stopping by." As he turned to leave, his eye caught a wooden plaque hanging above her desk, one he hadn't made. Carved into it were the words, "Education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire." "My brother made it," she explained, noticing his interest. "Before he enlisted, he knew I wanted to be a teacher." Deacon nodded, understanding the value of such a memento. "He'd be proud of you," he said quietly, then left before she could respond, before the walls he'd built around himself could crumble any further. Winter came early that year, blanketing redemption springs in snow and bringing with it the usual increase in illness. By mid-November, 3 children had died of fever, and Deacon found himself building the smallest crosses he'd ever made. Each one cut him deeper than any wound he'd sustained in battle. After placing the 3rd cross for little Emma Barnes, just 7 years old, he stood in the freezing cemetery long after dark, unmoving despite the biting cold. That's where Josephine found him, his figure silhouetted against the starlit snow. "You'll freeze to death," she said, wrapping a warm scarf around his neck. "Come inside. Father has coffee brewing." Deacon didn't move. "I keep thinking it should have been different," he said, his voice hoarse. "That I could have done something." "You didn't cause the fever, Deacon." "Not just the children," he clarified, the words spilling out now that the dam had broken. "All of them. The war, after, all the crosses I've built, so many deaths that shouldn't have happened." Josephine's gloved hand found his. "And how many of those deaths were by your hand?" The question jolted him. "What? You carry guilt for surviving. I see it every day, but how many of these deaths are actually your doing?" He couldn't answer. The truth was complicated, yes, he'd killed during the war as soldiers do. And after, when necessary, as he demonstrated with the stage robbers. But the weight he carried wasn't just about those he'd killed. It was about those he couldn't save. "I couldn't save my father," he finally said, "or my brother, or the men in my unit who looked to me for leadership. I survived when they didn't, and there's no sense to it." Josephine stepped closer, her face upturned to his in the moonlight. "No, there isn't. Death rarely makes sense." She squeezed his hand. "But life can if we let it." "I don't know how," he admitted, the confession torn from somewhere deep inside. "By living it," she said simply. "By building more than crosses." Before he could respond, she stretched up on her toes and pressed a kiss to his forehead, her lips warm against his cold skin. "Build a future now, Deacon," she whispered. "The dead have enough monuments." The moment hung between them, fragile and profound. Then Josephine stepped back, tugging gently on his hand. "Come inside before we both freeze." Tomorrow is soon enough to decide what to build next." Stunned by her words and the unexpected tenderness of her gesture, Deacon allowed himself to be led away from the cemetery toward the warm lights of town. Something had shifted between them, and within him, though he couldn't yet name what it was or what it might become. William looked up from his book as they entered the small house, raising an eyebrow at their clasped hands but saying nothing about it. "Ah, Deacon, just in time. I was telling Josephine earlier about my idea for expanding the school come spring." Grateful for the older man's tact, Deacon accepted a cup of coffee and settled into what had become his usual chair. As the conversation flowed around him, plans for the school, news of the town, William's latest letter from colleagues back east, Deacon found himself observing the warm scene as if from a distance. This feeling of belonging, of being part of something beyond his solitary existence, was both foreign and achingly familiar. Later, as he prepared to leave, Josephine walked him to the door. "Will you come to dinner tomorrow?" she asked. "It's Thanksgiving, and neither father nor I relish the idea of celebrating alone." Deacon hesitated. He hadn't observed a holiday since before the war. Each one had simply been another day to endure. "I wouldn't want to intrude on your family time." "It wouldn't be an intrusion," she said softly. "It would be a gift to us both." Looking into her earnest green eyes, Deacon found he couldn't refuse. "What time?" Her smile was worth any discomfort the occasion might bring. 2 o'clock, and Deacon. She caught his hand as he turned to go. "Thank you." "For what?" "For being willing to try." That night, alone in his sparse room above the mercantile, Deacon lay awake, replaying the moment of her kiss upon his forehead. Such a simple gesture, yet it had reached something in him that had been dormant for so long he'd forgotten its existence. Hope. Thanksgiving Day dawned clear and cold. Deacon spent the morning as he always did, checking the cemetery and ensuring no markers had been damaged by the recent snowfall. But for the first time, his thoughts were not wholly occupied by the dead. Instead, he found himself considering Josephine's words, "Build a future now." What would that even look like? He'd spent so long existing in the shadow of grief and guilt that the possibility of something more seemed almost incomprehensible. Yet when he thought of Josephine, her strength, her kindness, her determination to create something meaningful in this rough frontier town, he felt a stirring of possibility. At precisely 2 o'clock, Deacon found himself at the Gray's door, freshly shaved and wearing his one good shirt beneath his worn coat. In his hands, he awkwardly held a small wooden box he'd spent the night carving a gift that had taken shape beneath his tools, almost without conscious thought. William answered the door, his health much improved, though he still walked with a cane. "Right on time," the older man noted with approval. "Josie's just finishing in the kitchen. Come in, come in." The small house had been transformed for the occasion. Evergreen boughs adorned the mantel, filling the room with their fresh scent, and the table was set with what Deacon recognized as the Gray's good china items that had survived the journey west and the stagecoach attack. "Deacon." Josephine emerged from the kitchen, her face flushed from cooking, her copper hair pinned up but with the usual wayward strands framing her face. She wore a simple blue dress that brought out the green of her eyes, and Deacon found himself momentarily speechless at the sight of her. "I'm so glad you came. Wouldn't miss it," he managed, then thrust the wooden box toward her. "I made this, for you both." Josephine took it with careful hands, her eyes widening as she opened the lid. Inside lay a perfectly carved chess set, each piece detailed with remarkable precision. "Deacon, this is exquisite," she breathed, lifting the white queen to examine it more closely. "Your father mentioned he played," Deacon explained, watching her reaction, "and that you were learning." William approached, his expression one of genuine delight. "This is craftsmanship of the highest order, Deacon. You have a remarkable gift." "It's just wood," Deacon demurred, though he felt a flicker of pride at their appreciation. "It's far more than that," Josephine said, meeting his eyes. "It's thoughtfulness and beauty created from raw material." She set the piece back in its place. "Thank you." The meal that followed was the finest Deacon had eaten in years: roast chicken with all the trimmings, vegetables preserved from the fall harvest, and fresh bread that filled the house with its homey scent. The conversation flowed easily, William sharing stories of Thanksgivings passed in Boston, Josephine recounting amusing tales from her first weeks of teaching. Bobby Miller was convinced that Boston must be on the moon, based on how I described snow-covered streets and gas lamps. She laughed. I had to show him on a map that it's just very, very far east. The children are lucky to have you, Deacon said, finding it increasingly easy to express such thoughts aloud. Most teachers who come west don't stay long. Are you suggesting I might leave? Josephine asked, her tone light but her eyes searching his. Deacon considered his answer carefully. I think you're made of sterner stuff than most, but it's a hard life here. All life has hardship, she replied. What matters is whether there's purpose in it and people worth staying for. The look that passed between them was charged with unspoken meaning, and William cleared his throat, rising from his chair with exaggerated effort. I believe I'll retire to my book for a while, he announced. These old bones need rest, and you young people surely don't need my company for the entire afternoon. Father, Josephine protested, though without much conviction. William waved her off. Perhaps Deacon would enjoy seeing those books you received from Mrs. Jenkins in thanks for tutoring her son, the illustrated ones about native plants. With that transparent excuse, he retreated to his bedroom, leaving Deacon and Josephine alone in the small sitting area. An awkward silence fell between them, broken when they both spoke at once. I should help you clear the would you like some. They stopped, sharing a smile at the overlap. Ladies first, Deacon offered. I was only going to ask if you'd like coffee, Josephine said, and perhaps a game of chess with your beautiful set. I'd like that, he agreed, realizing it was true. The day had awakened something in him, a hunger not just for food, but for companionship, for normal human connection that had nothing to do with grief or obligation. As Josephine arranged the chess pieces, Deacon found himself studying her hands, graceful but strong, with a small ink stain on one finger from her teaching. Hands that created and nurtured rather than destroyed. Hands so different from his own. You're staring, she observed without looking up. Sorry, he said, embarrassed at being caught. Now she did look up, a smile playing at her lips. I didn't say I minded. The game began, with Josephine proving a more formidable opponent than Deacon had expected. As they played, the conversation turned to the future, the school expansion William had mentioned, Deacon's potential role in building it, Josephine's hopes for introducing more advanced subjects for the older students. Tom Jenkins has a real aptitude for mathematics, she noted, moving her knight to capture one of his pawns. With proper education, he could become an engineer. Out here, Deacon questioned, studying the board, why not? The West is growing. Railroads, bridges, buildings all need designing and building. Why shouldn't our children aspire to be more than their parents were? You see possibility everywhere, he observed, not unkindly. Josephine's eyes met his across the board. Not everywhere, she said softly. For the longest time, I couldn't see past my brother's death. It consumed me, defined me. I was the sister of the fallen soldier rather than simply Josephine. Deacon stilled, recognizing his own experience in her words. What changed? I realized I was burying myself with him, she said, her honesty striking him to the core. That he would have hated seeing me live that way, so I made a choice to honor him by living fully, not by dying slowly. The parallel to his own situation was too pointed to ignore. Deacon had been burying himself with each cross he built, defining himself by death rather than life. The realization sat heavy in his chest. It's not easy, he finally said. Letting go, no, she agreed, but necessary, and not something you have to do alone. Her hand moved across the chessboard, briefly covering his. Checkmate, by the way. Deacon glanced down, surprised to find his king trapped. You're full of surprises, Josephine Gray. I certainly hope so, she replied with a smile that warmed him more than any fire could. By the time Deacon left that evening, something fundamental had shifted. He walked back to his room feeling lighter, as if some of the burden he'd carried for so long had begun to ease. The future, which had for years been nothing more than an endless succession of days to endure, now held possibilities he hardly dared name. The winter deepened, bringing blizzards that isolated redemption springs for days at a time. The school closed during the worst weather, but Josephine organized reading groups in homes throughout town, ensuring education continued. Deacon found himself increasingly involved, transporting her through deep snow from house to house, building additional shelves for the growing collection of books William had ordered from back east, and even occasionally helping with lessons for the older boys who were interested in practical mathematics for construction. As Christmas approached, the town organized a celebration at the schoolhouse. Children practiced recitations and songs under Josephine's guidance, while the women planned refreshments, and the men arranged for a tree to be cut and brought inside a tradition from back east that was still novel in the frontier town. Deacon found himself drafted into service hanging decorations and setting up benches for the audience. Working alongside the other men, he realized with some surprise that he had become part of the community without consciously deciding to do so. These people who had once been strangers now greeted him by name, included him in their plans, valued his contributions. "Quite a change from last Christmas," Sheriff Miller remarked as they worked. "Don't recall seeing you at all during the holidays." Deacon shrugged, uncomfortable with the observation. Had no reason to participate. And now, the sheriff's eyes flicked meaningfully toward Josephine, who was across the room directing children in hanging paper chains. "Now I have responsibilities," Deacon replied evenly, though he knew his explanation convinced neither of them. The truth was more complex than he could articulate. Josephine had awakened something in him, not just romantic feelings, though those were undeniably present, but a sense of purpose beyond his solitary vigil at the cemetery. He still built crosses when needed, still maintained the graves, but it no longer consumed his days and thoughts. The Christmas celebration itself proved to be a turning point. After the children's performances and the communal feast, as families began to disperse into the snowy night, Deacon found himself lingering, helping Josephine and William gather their things. "Walk with us," Josephine asked, her cheeks pink from the festivities and perhaps something more. William immediately begged off. "You two go ahead. Mrs. Patterson offered to show me a first edition of Thoreau she recently received. I'll be along later." Deacon suspected collusion, but couldn't bring himself to object. The night was clear, stars brilliant above the snow-covered buildings, and Josephine's arm through his felt right in a way few things had since the war. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. When they reached the small bridge over the creek at the edge of town, Josephine paused, looking out over the ice-rimmed water reflecting starlight. "I have something for you," she said, reaching into her pocket. "A Christmas gift, though it's not much compared to your chess set." She handed him a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Deacon opened it carefully to find a leather-bound journal, the cover embossed with his initials. "I noticed you whittling a small figurine last week," she explained. "A horse, I think. You were working from memory, and it made me think perhaps you might like to design your projects before you build them. Sketches, measurements, ideas." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched him deeply. No one had given him a personal present in years, and certainly not one so perfectly suited to him. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate for what he felt. "You're welcome," she replied, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "I believe in your hands, Deacon. Not just what they've built in the past, but what they might create in the future." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibility. Without conscious decision, Deacon found himself reaching for her, his hands gentle as they framed her face. Josephine's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she stepped closer, her hands coming to rest on his chest. "I'm not whole," he warned, giving her one last chance to retreat. "There are parts of me that may never heal." "None of us are whole," she whispered back. "We all carry scars. The question is whether we let them define us." And then he was kissing her, his lips meeting hers beneath the winter stars. The kiss was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand, but when Josephine's arms slid around his neck in response, it deepened into something more profound, a promise, a beginning. When they finally broke apart, Deacon rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as he absorbed the magnitude of what had just happened. For the first time in nearly a decade, he had allowed himself to reach for happiness, to consider a future that held more than solitary grief. "Josie," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. "I know," she replied, understanding what he couldn't yet articulate. "I feel it too." The walk back to her home was filled with a new awareness, their hands clasped, shoulders touching. At her door, he kissed her once more, briefly but with clear intent. "Good night," he said, reluctant to leave but knowing it was proper. "Good night, Deacon," she replied, her smile illuminating the darkness. "Merry Christmas." As he walked back to his room, the journal clutched in his hand, Deacon felt as though he'd awakened from a long, dark dream. The ghosts that had haunted him for so long seemed less substantial now, less able to claim his soul. In their place was the memory of Josephine's lips on his, her belief in his hands, her vision of a future worth building. The new year brought change to Redemption Springs. The town council, impressed by Deacon's work at the school, approached him about taking on the role of town carpenter officially. There was talk of a new church being built in the spring, and several families wanted proper homes to replace their hastily constructed cabins. "It would be steady work," Mayor Hollister explained, "and we'd provide a workshop space. The town's growing, Kincaid. We need skilled craftsmen who can stay, not just pass through." The offer represented everything Deacon had avoided since the war: permanence, commitment to a place and people, a future that extended beyond the next sunrise. In the past, he would have declined immediately, already planning his departure. Now he found himself considering it, picturing a life built here, with roots that went deeper than the crosses he placed in the cemetery soil. "I'll think about it," he told the mayor, which was more encouragement than the man had expected. That evening, he shared the news with Josephine and William as they sat around the chessboard, engaged in what had become a regular evening ritual. "That's wonderful," Josephine exclaimed, her eyes lighting up. "You'd be perfect for the position." William nodded agreement. "The school desks alone demonstrate your skill, and I've seen your designs in that journal Josie gave you. You have vision, Deacon." "It would mean staying," Deacon said, watching Josephine's reaction carefully, "committing to Redemption Springs. Is that so terrible a prospect?" She asked, her voice soft but her gaze direct. Before he could answer, a pounding at the door interrupted them. Sheriff Miller's voice called urgently from outside. "Kincaid, you in there? We need you." Deacon opened the door to find the sheriff breathless, his expression grim. "What's happened?" "Stage got hit again. Same spot as before, but this time they took hostages the 2 women passengers. We're forming a posse. Could use your tracking skills." Josephine appeared at Deacon's side. "When did this happen?" "About 2 hours ago." "Driver managed to get back to town despite a bullet in his arm." "I'll get my rifle," Deacon said, already moving toward the hook where his coat hung. Josephine caught his arm. "Be careful," she said, her eyes conveying far more than her words. He nodded once, then followed the sheriff out into the cold night, where a group of men on horseback waited. Within minutes, they were riding hard toward the ambush site, Deacon's mind shifting back to the tactical awareness that had kept him alive during the war. The hostages' complicated matters rescuing them would require more than just firepower. The attack site revealed a scene of violence, blood on the snow, the stagecoach riddled with bullets, abandoned luggage scattered about. Using skills honed during the conflict, Deacon quickly found tracks leading north toward the rocky foothills. 4 men, he reported to the sheriff. 2 horses carrying double, that'll be the women. They're headed for Blackwater Canyon, Miller cursed. Perfect place for an ambush. Narrow trails, plenty of cover. We need to circle around, Deacon suggested, already formulating a plan. Come at them from above, not behind. They'll expect pursuit, but not from that direction. The sheriff nodded, deferring to Deacon's expertise. Lead the way. What followed was a grueling night ride through treacherous terrain, the men pushing their horses as hard as they dared in the darkness. By dawn, they had positioned themselves on the ridge above the canyon where Deacon suspected the outlaws would make camp. He wasn't wrong. In a small clearing below, protected by rock formations on 3 sides, 4 men huddled around a fire. The 2 women sat apart, bound and clearly terrified but alive. Deacon assessed the situation with cold precision, noting the outlaws' positions, weapons, lines of sight. "We need to split up," he told the sheriff quietly. "2 men to work down to those rocks on the east side, 2 to the west. The rest stay here as covering fire. When I give the signal, we hit them from 3 sides simultaneously." The plan was executed with military efficiency. Deacon took the eastern approach himself, moving silently through the underbrush until he was within 20 yards of the nearest outlaw. When all were in position, he fired a single shot into the air, the signal. Chaos erupted as gunfire rained down from multiple directions. One outlaw fell immediately, another took cover behind a boulder, returning fire. Deacon moved swiftly toward the women, keeping low. "Down," he shouted as he reached them, pulling both to the ground as bullets whizzed overhead. Working quickly, he cut their bonds with his knife. "When I say run, head straight for those rocks," he instructed, pointing to where another posse member waited to cover their escape. A bullet kicked up dirt inches from his face, and Deacon rolled, coming up with his rifle raised. He fired twice in quick succession, hitting the outlaw who had shot at him. The man crumpled, his gun falling from lifeless hands. "Now," Deacon yelled to the women. "Run." As they bolted for safety, he provided covering fire, drawing the remaining outlaw's attention. A bullet grazed his arm, tearing through his sleeve and leaving a burning trail across his flesh. Gritting his teeth against the pain, Deacon continued firing until the sheriff's voice rang out from above. "It's over, Kincaid. We got 'em all." The aftermath was familiar: the accounting of the dead, the care of the wounded, the relief of those saved. 3 outlaws dead, 1 captured alive. None of the posse killed, though 2 sustained injuries. The women, shaken but unharmed, expressed tearful gratitude. "You saved our lives," the older woman told Deacon as they prepared to return to town. "How can we ever repay you?" Deacon, his arm bandaged by one of the men, shook his head. "No need, just doing what needed doing." But as they rode back to Redemption Springs, he found himself reflecting on the night's events with new perspective. In the past, such violence would have reinforced his belief that the world was irredeemably brutal, that death was the only constant. Now, he saw something different: the community that had come together to protect its own, the lives that had been preserved, the justice that had been served. By the time they reached town the following afternoon, word of their success had preceded them. A crowd gathered in the main street, cheering as the posse rode in. Deacon, uncomfortable with the attention, tried to slip away unnoticed, but a familiar voice called his name. "Deacon." Josephine pushed through the crowd, her face pale with worry that transformed to relief as she saw him. Without hesitation, she threw her arms around him, heedless of the dirt and blood on his clothing. "Thank God," she whispered against his chest, "when we heard there was shooting." "I'm all right," he assured her, awkwardly aware of the public nature of their embrace but unwilling to end it. She pulled back slightly, noticing his bandaged arm. "You're hurt." "It's nothing, barely a scratch." The look she gave him made it clear she didn't believe him, but she didn't press the issue in front of the crowd. Instead, she simply took his hand. "Come home," she said. "Father's been worried too." Home. The word resonated through him as he allowed her to lead him away from the crowd, not his solitary room but the warmth of the gray house. Home, later after Dr. Patterson had properly cleaned and rebandaged his wound. After he'd washed away the grime of the mission and changed into a spare shirt of William's, after a hot meal and quiet conversation, Deacon found himself alone with Josephine on the small porch despite the winter chill. "I've decided to take the town carpenter position," he told her, his decision crystallized by the events of the past day. Josephine's face brightened. "You're staying then?" "Yes," he confirmed, taking her hands in his. "I'm staying. May I ask what changed your mind?" Deacon considered the question carefully. "When we were riding back today, I realized something. All these years, I've been marking deaths focused on what's been lost. But last night, we saved lives, we protected something, and it felt..." He searched for the right word. "It felt like purpose." "Purpose is important," she agreed, her eyes searching his. "So are roots," he continued, "and reasons to build something lasting." He took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "Josephine, I'm not a wealthy man." I don't have much to offer except these hands and whatever future I can build with them, but if you'd consider, if you might someday want." She silenced him with a finger to his lips, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Yes," she said simply. "Whatever you're trying to ask, my answer is yes." Deacon's heart swelled with emotion too profound for words. Instead, he drew her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that promised everything: commitment, passion. A future built together rather than a past endured alone. "I love you," he whispered against her mouth, the words he'd thought never to speak again. "And I love you," she replied, her voice steady and sure. "Not despite your scars, but including them. They're part of what made you the man you are, the man I love." In that moment, under the winter stars, Deacon finally understood what Josephine had meant that night in the cemetery. Build a future now. Not forgetting the past, not dishonoring those lost, but refusing to remain buried with them, choosing life over an endless vigil for the dead. Spring arrived with its promise of renewal, the harsh winter giving way to green shoots and warmer days. Redemption Springs bustled with activity as new construction began, including the church Deacon had been commissioned to help design and build. His workshop, established in a former livery stable, quickly became a center for both practical craftsmanship and artistic creation. The wedding was set for June, after the school term ended. William, fully recovered from his wound, would give away the bride, and the entire town planned to attend. It would be, Mayor Hollister declared, the social event of the year, a celebration not just of two people joining their lives, but of the community's growth and future. As the day approached, Deacon spent his evenings working on a special project, a bed frame of walnut and oak, intricately carved with patterns of wildflowers and grasses native to the Arizona territory. It would be his wedding gift to Josephine, a tangible symbol of the future they would build together. The night before the wedding, he visited the cemetery one last time as a single man. The crosses stood in neat rows, each one a testament to a life lived and lost. But they no longer seemed to accuse him of surviving. Instead, they reminded him of the preciousness of life, the importance of living it fully while one had the chance. At the newest graves, those of the outlaws killed during the hostage rescue, Deacon paused. Even these men, who had chosen violence and cruelty, deserved the dignity of being remembered. Their crosses were as carefully made as any others, their names burned into the wood despite their crimes. Redemption, Deacon had come to believe, was possible for the living. For the dead, remembrance was the only mercy left to offer. As he turned to leave, he noticed Josephine standing at the cemetery gate, watching him with understanding in her eyes. Without words, she came to stand beside him, her hand slipping into his. "I'll always build the crosses when needed," he said after a moment. "It's important work." "I know," she replied, leaning her head against his shoulder, "but it's not your only work anymore." Together they walked back toward town, toward the future they would build: a home, a family, a life rich with purpose and meaning. The ghosts of the past would always be present, acknowledged and honored, but no longer permitted to overshadow the blessings of the present. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, the kind of June morning that seemed designed for beginnings. The small church, though not yet complete, had been prepared for the occasion, with wildflowers decorating every available surface and sunlight streaming through the newly installed windows. As Deacon stood at the altar, watching Josephine walk toward him on her father's arm, her copper hair crowned with flowers, her green eyes fixed on his, he felt a sense of wholeness that had eluded him since before the war. This woman who had seen his darkness and loved him anyway, who had kissed his forehead in a snow-covered cemetery and challenged him to build more than monuments to the dead, she was his redemption, his future, his home. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, his voice carrying through the packed church, "we are gathered here today." The words of the ceremony washed over Deacon, but it was Josephine's voice speaking her vows that truly reached him. Clear and unwavering, she promised to love him through all the seasons of their life together, to build alongside him, to face whatever came with courage and faith. When it was his turn, Deacon's voice roughened with emotion but never faltered. "I promise to honor your strength and your gentleness, to build with these hands a life worthy of your love, to remember the past without being imprisoned by it, and to face each new day grateful for the gift of sharing it with you." As they exchanged rings, simple gold bands that represented unbroken commitment, Deacon felt the final pieces of his fractured self coming together. Not healed completely, perhaps, but mended in the way of Japanese pottery, where the broken places are filled with gold and become part of the beauty rather than flaws to be hidden. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister concluded. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The kiss they shared sealed their commitment before the community that had become their extended family. As they turned to face the congregation, hands joined, Deacon saw not just faces but stories the children Josephine taught, the men who had ridden with him to rescue the hostages, the women who had welcomed her into their circle, William beaming with fatherly pride. These people were no longer strangers to be avoided but neighbors to be cherished, each one part of the tapestry of life in Redemption Springs. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with music and dancing, food and laughter. Deacon, never comfortable as the center of attention, nevertheless found himself enjoying the genuine goodwill that surrounded them. When William raised a toast to the couple, his words resonated with truth. "To my daughter and new son," the older man said, his voice carrying across the town square where tables had been set up. "May you build together not just a home but a legacy of love that outlasts the wooden crosses and even the stone markers that will someday bear all our names. For it is not how we mark our deaths that matters, but how we live our lives." Later, as they walked to the new home, Deacon had prepared for them a modest but well-built cabin on the edge of town with a view of both the mountains and the settlement. Josephine squeezed his hand. "Happy?" she asked, though she surely knew the answer. "More than I believed possible," he replied honestly. "You gave me back my future, Josie. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to deserve that gift." She stopped, turning to face him in the moonlight. "You deserved it all along, Deacon. You just needed someone to remind you." Standing on tiptoe, she kissed his forehead just as she had that night in the cemetery. "Build a future now," she whispered. "With me." Lifting her into his arms, Deacon carried his bride across the threshold of their home, into the room where the carved bed waited to receive them. As he set her down beside it, Josephine ran her fingers over the intricate wildflower carvings with wonder. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Like having a meadow indoors. So we never forget to look for beauty, even in winter," he explained, watching her reaction with nervous anticipation. "Do you like it?" Her answer was in her eyes as she drew him down beside her. "I love it, and I love the hands that made it." That night, as they consummated their marriage in the bed he had built for them, Deacon finally allowed himself to fully embrace the future. The ghosts of the past would never completely vanish. The crosses in the cemetery would still need tending. The memories would still sometimes wake him in the night, but they no longer defined him. What defined him now was this: the love of a good woman, the respect of a community, the work of his hands building rather than burying, and the promise of days ahead filled with purpose. Epilogue: 5 years later, the sound of children's laughter drifted through the open window of Deacon's workshop as he put the finishing touches on a small wooden horse. Through the doorway, he could see his 4-year-old son William and 2-year-old daughter Eleanor playing under the watchful eye of their grandfather in the yard of what had become a substantial family home. The shop itself had expanded too, with 3 apprentices now learning the craft under Deacon's guidance. The latest project, an elaborate pulpit for the church, stood nearly complete in the center of the space, its panels carved with scenes from scripture and local imagery: mountains, desert flowers, the winding creek that gave life to the valley. "Papa, come see." Little William called, his voice carrying the same clear tone as his mother's. Deacon set down his tools and stepped outside, wiping his hands on his apron. The boy had constructed a precarious tower of sticks and was beaming with pride at his creation. "Well now, that's fine work," Deacon said, crouching to examine it. "You've got a good eye for balance." "Like his father," Josephine remarked, approaching from the direction of the school with a basket of fresh bread from the bakery. Her hair was still the same vibrant copper, though she now wore it in a practical braid while teaching. At 32, she had a quiet confidence that only made her more beautiful in Deacon's eyes. "Did you finish the horse?" she asked, nodding toward the workshop. "Just now." "It'll be ready for Sarah Jenkins' birthday tomorrow." The older William, now silver-haired but still sharp as ever, looked up from the book he was sharing with little Alina. "Tom will be pleased. He's worked hard for that promotion at the railroad office." Tom Jenkins, once the sullen 14-year-old who had resisted schooling, was now a promising young surveyor for the railroad, married with a daughter of his own. His transformation was one of Josephine's proudest achievements as a teacher. As they gathered for the evening meal in the home Deacon had expanded 3 times to accommodate their growing family, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. From the solitary figure building crosses in a windswept cemetery to the husband, father, craftsman, and community member, he now was. The change seemed almost miraculous. Yet it had happened one day at a time, one choice at a time. The choice to stay rather than flee. The choice to build rather than merely mark loss. The choice to love despite the risk of pain. The choice to embrace life with all its imperfections rather than merely endure it. Later, after the children were asleep and William had retired to his rooms in the East Wing, Deacon and Josephine sat on the porch in the gathering darkness, her head resting against his shoulder as they watched the stars appear. "Sheriff Miller mentioned there's a new family arriving next week," Josephine said. "From Virginia. The father was wounded at Petersburg, lost an arm." Deacon nodded, understanding the unspoken question. "I'll speak with him. Offer work if he has any skill with his remaining hand. Or we'll find something else." "You're a good man, Deacon Kincaid," she said, lifting her face for his kiss. "Only because you believed I could be," he replied, brushing his lips against hers. Later still, as they lay together in the bed, he had carved with wildflowers now burnished by years of use to a rich patina. Josephine traced the scar on his arm from the bullet graze during the hostage rescue. "Do you ever regret staying?" she asked, a question she posed every year on their anniversary, choosing this life instead of moving on. And as he did every year, Deacon gathered her close, breathing in the lavender scent that still clung to her hair. "Never," he answered truthfully, "not for a single moment." For he had learned what she had tried to teach him that night in the cemetery, that honoring the dead did not require joining them in their graves, that building crosses could coexist with building a future, and that love, once embraced, was stronger than grief. As redemption springs slumbered around them, the Kincaid family slept peacefully beneath a roof built by the hands that had once only marked endings, but now created beginnings every day. And in the cemetery at the edge of town, the crosses stood as they always had, tended regularly but no longer the center of a man's existence. They were what they should be, monuments to lives that had been, standing in silent witness to lives still being lived, still being built, one day at a time.